The Mist over Tol Brandir, an epic tale of Middle-earth. The autumn winds bore tidings of unrest to the White City, and in the halls of Minas Tirith, Prince Imrahil of Dol Amroth stood before the steward's chair, his sea-gray cloak still damp from the spray of Anduin's waters. The great river had carried him swiftly from the southern fiefs, yet not swift enough to quell the growing concern that gnawed at his heart. "My lord Denethor," spoke Imrahil, his voice carrying the measured cadence of one accustomed to command. "The reports from our river wardens speak of strange happenings near the falls of Roro. A mist has settled upon Tol Brandir that does not lift with dawn, nor is it driven by any wind. Ships that venture too near speak of voices calling from within, yet none who enter the mist return to tell their tale." Denethor, son of Icthelion, sat rigid upon his seat, his piercing eyes fixed upon the great map of Gondor that adorned the eastern wall. His fingers drummed against the arm of his chair, a rhythm that spoke of deep contemplation and deeper worry. The steward had aged much in recent months, the burden of his office weighing heavily upon his shoulders as shadows lengthened across the realm. "Tol Brandir," he murmured, the name falling from his lips like a stone cast into still water. "The Tindrock. Long has that isle stood sentinel at the gates of Argonath, unmoved by the passage of ages. If indeed some shadow has fallen upon it, then we must know the nature of this threat, ere it spreads like poison through the veins of Anduin." From the shadows near the great window stepped Captain Boromir, heir to the stewardship, his horn of Gondor gleaming at his side. His broad frame filled the doorway as he entered, and his eyes held the fire that burned in all the sons of that ancient line. "Father, grant me leave to lead a company northward. If there is peril upon the river, let us meet it with steel and courage, as our forebears did in days of old." Yet Denethor raised his hand, and his gaze turned inward, as if consulting some hidden counsel. "Nay, my son, this matter requires not the sword alone, but wisdom and knowledge of things that lie beyond the realm of men. I have sent word to Rivendell and to the Grey Havens, seeking counsel from those whose memory spans the long years." Prince Imrahil shifted upon his feet, the weight of his mail subtle beneath his rich cloak. "My lord, with respect, time may be our enemy in this matter. Already 3 ships have vanished within the mist, and the river folk speak of lights that dance upon the water when darkness falls. If we wait for counsel from afar, how many more may be lost?" The steward's eyes sharpened, and he leaned forward in his chair. "Tell me more of these lights, Prince of Dol Amroth. What manner of illumination burns within the mist, and at what hour do they appear?" "The tales vary, my lord, as tales oft do when fear takes hold of men's hearts. Some speak of green fire that dances like will-o'-the-wisp, leading ships to their doom upon the rocky shores of the isle. Others tell of a great beacon that burns atop Tol Brandir's peak, visible only to those caught within the mist's embrace. But all agree upon this: the lights appear when the moon is dark, and those who see them are drawn as moths to flame." Boromir stepped forward, his hand instinctively moving to rest upon his sword hilt. "Then let us strike swiftly, before the next dark moon rises. A company of our finest soldiers, with good boats and keen eyes, could pierce this mystery and return with answer." "And if this mystery pierces them instead?" countered Denethor, rising from his seat to pace before the great map. "Nay, there is more at work here than mere sorcery or the malice of our enemies. Tol Brandir has stood unmarked by shadow since the days of Isildur. If now some power has awakened there, we must approach with all the wisdom at our command." A knock upon the great doors interrupted their counsel, and at Denethor's word, a messenger entered, bearing the white rod of his office and the dust of hard riding upon his cloak. He knelt before the steward's chair, his breath coming in short gasps as he spoke. "My lord, urgent word from the northern border. Captain Faramir sends this message from Osgiliath. Strange folk have been seen upon the eastern roads, traveling northward toward the Eamon Muil. They bear no banner of any realm known to our guards, yet they move with purpose and great haste. Some among them are said to be tall and fair, as if the blood of the ancient days flows still in their veins. Denethor's eyes kindled with sudden interest, and he turned from the map to face the messenger. How many in their company, and what manner of arms do they bear? Perhaps a score, my lord, maybe more. They travel light, with no great baggage train, but our watchers report that their weapons gleam with craftsmanship beyond the common sort. And there is this, which Captain Faramir deemed most strange. At their head rides one whose hair shines like starlight, and upon his brow sits a circlet of silver. The silence that followed this report was heavy with implication, and Prince Imrahil felt the currents of fate shifting like the tides he knew so well. "My lord," he said quietly, "if indeed the firstborn walk again openly upon the roads of Gondor, then the matter of Tol Brandir may be of greater import than we first believed." Denethor nodded slowly, his mind clearly racing through possibilities and connections that remained hidden from his council. "Summon Captain Faramir to return to the city with all haste, and send word to Dol Amroth that Prince Imrahil's ships should make ready for a journey northward, but let them wait upon our command. This web grows ever more tangled, and I would see all the threads before we attempt to unweave it." As the messenger departed to carry out these orders, Boromir approached his father with concern, written plain upon his face. "What thoughts trouble you, father? Surely the return of the Eldar to our borders is cause for hope, not fear." "Hope and fear oft walk hand in hand, my son," replied Denethor. "And when the firstborn emerge from their hidden realms to walk openly among us, it betokens times of great change or great peril. The mist upon Tol Brandir, the lights that dance in darkness, the coming of the elves. These threads weave together in a pattern I cannot yet discern, but one that fills my heart with foreboding." Prince Imrahil moved to the great window, gazing northward toward the distant reaches of Anduin, where the troubled waters flowed past the ancient isle. "Perhaps, my lord, the pattern will become clear when all the players have taken their places upon the board. Until then, we must prepare for whatever revelations the mist may bring forth." And so the three lords of Gondor stood in contemplation as the shadows lengthened in the chamber, each lost in thoughts of the days to come. Beyond the walls of Minas Tirith, the great river flowed ever northward, carrying upon its waters the seeds of a tale that would echo through the halls of memory long after the mist had lifted from Tol Brandir's ancient stone. The wind from the sea brought with it the scent of rain, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled like the drums of war. 7 days after the messenger's arrival in Minas Tirith, Captain Faramir rode through the gates of the White City, with grim tidings etched upon his weathered face. The dust of the eastern roads clung to his cloak, and his horse bore the marks of hard traveling. Yet his eyes burned with the urgency of his message. He sought no rest nor refreshment, but went straightway to his father's hall. "The company I spoke of has passed beyond Osgiliath," he reported, standing before Denethor's chair with the rigid bearing of a soldier. "They crossed the river at the old ford, moving with such swiftness that our guards scarce had time to mark their passage. But this much I learned from speaking with the ferryman: their leader bears a name from the ancient days, though I scarce dare voice it." Denethor leaned forward, his knuckles white as they gripped the arms of his seat. "Speak, my son. In these dark hours, we must grasp at whatever knowledge presents itself, however strange it may seem." The ferryman called him Lord Erestor, my father, he who once dwelt in Rivendell as counselor to Master Elrond. If the tales speak true, he has not been seen in the lands of men for nigh on 1,000 years. A sharp intake of breath came from Prince Imrahil, who had remained in the city awaiting word of developments. Erestor of Rivendell? But surely he would have traveled openly, bearing messages of friendship from the hidden valley. Why this secrecy, this haste? "That is what troubles me most deeply," replied Faramir. "For when the ferryman hailed them with words of welcome, asking if they bore greetings from Master Elrond, the one called Erestor replied only that time was short, and that the stars themselves had foretold a great peril rising from the depths of memory. Then he paid the ferryman's fee with a silver coin, bearing the likeness of Gil-galad, and spoke no more until they had crossed to the eastern shore. Boromir, who had been sharpening his sword in the corner of the chamber, set down his whetstone and rose to his full height. "Father, surely this confirms that the matter of Tol Brandir touches upon events far greater than we first supposed. If the wise have sent forth one of their own with such urgency, then we delay at our peril." But Denethor held up his hand for silence, his gaze turning inward, as if seeking guidance from the palantir that lay hidden in his private chamber. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of decision long pondered. "Nay, my son, we shall not blunder forward in ignorance, no matter how urgent the hour may seem, but neither shall we remain idle while shadows gather upon our border." He turned to Prince Imrahil, his eyes holding a glint of the old fire that had once made him the most formidable of Gondor's lord. "My friend, how swift are the ships of Dol Amroth, and how skilled are their crews in the navigation of treacherous waters. Swift as the sea wind, my lord, and their crews are descended from the mariners of Númenor. They know every current and hidden rock from Pelargir to the borders of Rohan." "Why do you ask?" "Because I would send a company northward by water, moving with stealth and cunning rather than the thunder of armies. A small band of chosen warriors, led by one who understands both the ways of war and the deeper mysteries that may be at work. They shall observe this Lord Erestor and his company from afar, and learn what they may of the peril that draws them to Tol Brandir." Faramir stepped forward, his young face eager with the prospect of action. "Grant me this task, father. I know the riverways as well as any in Gondor, and my rangers are skilled in the arts of concealment and woodcraft." "Nay," said Denethor, but his voice held no harshness, only the firmness of absolute decision. "This task requires more than skill at arms or knowledge of the wild places. It requires one who can speak with the firstborn as an equal, and who carries the authority to act in Gondor's name, should circumstances demand it." His gaze fell upon Prince Imrahil, and an understanding passed between them that needed no word. "You would have me lead this company?" asked Imrahil, though his tone suggested he had already guessed his fate. "I would," replied Denethor. "Your blood carries the heritage of Númenor undiluted, and you have walked in the halls of both Rivendell and Lothlorien. If any among us can divine the true purpose of Lord Erestor's mission, it is you." Prince Imrahil bowed his head in acceptance, though his thoughts raced ahead to the preparations that would be required. "How many shall I take, and what manner of vessel?" "A score of your finest knights, no more. Speed and secrecy must be your watchwords, not strength of arm. Take the ship Númenor. She is swift and silent, and her captain knows the river as a scholar knows his books. You shall depart at dawn, 2 days hence, and follow in the wake of this mysterious company." Boromir's face darkened with disappointment, but he held his peace, knowing well his father's mind once it was set. Yet Denethor marked his son's expression and spoke gently to him. "Your time will come, my son, and sooner than you might wish. But for now, I have another task for you. Take a company of your choosing and ride westward to Dol Amroth. If Prince Imrahil does not return within a month's turning, you are to assume command of the investigation and proceed with whatever force you deem necessary." "A month?" protested Imrahil. "Surely that is overlong for such a mission." "Time moves strangely around the ancient places," replied Denethor, and for a moment his voice seemed to echo with memories not his own. "A day in the mist may be as a year in the sunlight, or a year may pass as a day. I would not have you counted among the lost before we truly know the nature of what lurks in the shadows of Tol Brandir." As the three lords made their plans, none noticed the raven that perched upon the windowsill, its dark eyes fixed intently upon their counsel. When at last they departed to make their preparation, the bird spread its wings and launched itself into the growing dusk, flying northward with purpose toward the distant waters where mist gathered like the breath of sleeping giants. In the harbor of Dol Amroth, the ship Númenor swayed gently at her moorings, her silver-painted hull gleaming in the starlight. Her captain, a weathered mariner named Círdan the Younger, so called to distinguish him from the great shipwright of old, supervised the loading of supplies with the meticulous care of one who had learned that the smallest oversight could mean the difference between life and death upon the water. The knights who would accompany Prince Imrahil arrived at the harbor in small groups, their armor darkened to avoid unwanted attention, and their faces grave with the knowledge that they sailed toward an uncertain fate. Among them was Sir Dervarin, whose father had fallen at the Battle of the Pelennor field, and whose skill with blade and bow was matched only by his loyalty to the Prince of Dol Amroth. "My lord," said Dervarin, as he supervised the stowing of weapons in the ship's armory, "what are we to do if we encounter this Lord Aristor? Surely we cannot hope to remain hidden from the keen sight of the firstborn." Prince Imrahil considered this question as he watched the last of the supplies being loaded. "We shall cross that bridge when we come to it, my friend. But remember, our mission is to observe and learn, not to interfere. If we are discovered, we shall approach openly and offer our aid, as befits the courtesy due to the elder folk." The moon was setting behind the mountains when Numaramar slipped her mooring and glided silently from the harbor, her dark sails barely visible against the star-scattered sky. Behind her, the lights of Dol Amroth faded into the distance, and ahead lay the wide waters of Anduin and whatever secrets the mist might reveal. On the deck of the ship, Prince Imrahil stood at the prow, his keen eyes searching the darkness ahead. The wind bore to his nostrils the scent of the river, mixed with something else, a strange fragrance that seemed to whisper of ancient days and half-forgotten magic. Whatever awaited them at Tol Brandir, he reflected, it would not be a matter easily resolved by sword and shield alone. The waters of Anduin ran dark and swift beneath the hull of Numaramar as she made her way northward through the night. Prince Imrahil had chosen to travel by darkness to avoid the notice of any who might be watching the river, and Captain Círdan the Younger proved his worth by navigating the treacherous currents with a skill that spoke of decades upon the water. As dawn broke over the eastern shore, they had passed Pelargir and were approaching the wilder stretches of the river where few settlements marked the banks. Here the current ran stronger, carrying with it the whispered tales of the northern reaches, where the Entwash joined the great flow, and the shadows of Fangorn reached down to touch the water. "Hold steady," called Círdan from his place at the steering oar, his weathered hands sure upon the carved wood. "We approach the mouths of Entwash, where the water runs confused and full of hidden snags. I would not have us founder on some sunken log for want of proper caution." Prince Imrahil made his way aft, moving with the easy balance of one long accustomed to the sea's motion. "How fare we for time, Captain? I would know if Lord Aristor's company maintains their lead, or if we have gained upon them in the night. By my reckoning, my lord, they cannot be more than half a day ahead." A company traveling by land must follow the winding of the road, while the river runs straight as the flight of an arrow. If they have not yet reached Caer Andros, we may overtake them before they pass the Isle of Boats. The mention of Caer Andros brought a frown to the prince's brow, for that ancient fortress commanded a vital ford of Anduin and had long served as a bulwark against enemies from the east. If Lord Aristor's company sought to cross there, they would surely be questioned by the garrison, and word might reach Osgiliath before the day was done. "Sir Dervarin," he called to his lieutenant, who stood watch at the forward rail, "what think you of this haste that drives the Lord of Rivendell? In all the tales I have heard, the elves are patient as stone, taking counsel for years before deciding upon action. Yet this Aristor moves with the urgency of one fleeing from fire." Dervarin turned from his contemplation of the passing shore, his young face troubled by thoughts that went deeper than mere curiosity. "My lord, there is something else that disturbs me. When I was but a child, my grandfather told me tales of the elder days, and in those stories, Aristor of Rivendell was accounted one of the most cautious of the wise. He was called the Keeper of Memories, for he hoarded knowledge as a dragon hoards gold, and would not share it lightly. And yet, mused Imrahil, here he rides openly through our land, carrying silver coins that bear the likeness of kings long dead, speaking of perils foretold by the stars themselves. Either some great doom approacheth, or He paused, unwilling to voice the darker possibility that had begun to form in his mind. "Or," prompted Dervarin, "or this is not the Aristor of whom the tales speak," finished the prince quietly. "There are powers in the world that can take fair form and speak with honeyed voices, the better to deceive the unwary. I pray that I am wrong, but we must be prepared for any eventuality." Their conversation was interrupted by a call from the masthead, where young Sir Galador kept watch with the sharp eyes of youth. "Ships ahead, my lord. 3 vessels moored near the eastern bank, bearing the white tree of Gondor upon their sails." Prince Imrahil raised his hand to shade his eyes, peering ahead through the morning mist that clung to the water. Indeed, he could make out the shapes of 3 river barges, their crews apparently making ready to depart. As Numeramar drew closer, he could see armed men upon the decks, their mail gleaming in the strengthening light. "They fly the banner of Caer Andros," observed Dervarin. "A patrol, perhaps, or supplies for the fortress." But even as he spoke, one of the strange vessels began to move, its oars biting deep into the current as it pulled away from the shore. The other 2 followed swiftly, and within moments, all 3 were moving in formation up the river, their course set for the northern reaches, where Tol Brandir waited in its shroud of mist. "This grows ever stranger," muttered Captain Círdan. "In all my years upon the water, I have never seen the garrison of Caer Andros send 3 full companies upriver without word to the steward. What enemy could threaten the northern reaches that would require such force?" Prince Imrahil's mind raced through the possibility, connecting threads of rumor and suspicion into a pattern that filled him with growing unease. "Signal them to heave to," he commanded. "I would speak with their captain before we proceed further." Círdan nodded and raised the great horn of Dol Amroth, its silver voice echoing across the water with the authority of ancient king. The lead vessel responded by raising a parley flag, and soon the 2 ships lay alongside each other in the middle of the current. The captain who came aboard Numeramar was a man of middle years, his face marked by weather and worry. He bore the insignia of Caer Andros upon his surcoat, but his eyes held a strange light that made Prince Imrahil's hand drift unconsciously toward his sword hilt. "I am Captain Forlong," said the man, his voice carrying the accent of southern Gondor. "We bear urgent orders from the steward to investigate strange happenings near the falls of Rorros." "By what authority do you question the movements of Gondor's soldiers?" "By the authority of my blood and my oath," replied Imrahil coldly. "I am Prince of Dol Amroth, and I too bear orders from Lord Denethor. What manner of strange happenings require 3 companies of soldiers?" For a moment, Captain Forlong's composure slipped, and something flickered behind his eyes that was not entirely human. But the moment passed so quickly that Imrahil wondered if he had imagined it. "Ships have vanished in the mist that surrounds Tol Brandir," said Forlong, his voice steady once more. "The steward commands that we investigate and report our finding. Surely you do not question the wisdom of such caution." There was something in the man's tone that suggested challenge, as if he dared the prince to find fault with his mission. But Imrahil had not survived decades of court intrigue and border warfare without learning to read the subtle signs of deception. "Of course not," he replied smoothly. "Indeed, I am bound upon the same errand. Perhaps we might coordinate our efforts?" "That would be unwise," said Forlong. And now there was definitely something strange in his manner. The steward's orders were most specific. "We are to proceed alone and in secrecy. Your presence would only complicate matters." "Secrecy?" repeated Imrahil, his eyebrows rising. "Yet you fly the banners of Gondor openly, and your ships are well known to every river warden between here and Osgiliath. What manner of secrecy is this?" Captain Forlong's hand moved to rest upon his sword hilt, and the men behind him shifted subtly, their own weapons loose in their sheaths. "I think, my Lord Prince, that you ask too many questions. Perhaps it would be better if you returned to Dol Amroth and left this matter to those better equipped to handle it." The threat was subtle but unmistakable, and Prince Imrahil felt the familiar tightening in his chest that always preceded battle. Around him, his own knights had noted the change in atmosphere and were quietly preparing for action. "I think not," said Imrahil quietly. "I think instead that you are not who you claim to be, and that these ships bear no true orders from my lord Denethor. Stand down, sir, and submit to questioning, or face the consequences of your deception." For a long moment, the two groups of armed men faced each other across the narrow space between the ships, the only sound the gentle lapping of water against the hull. Then Captain Forlong smiled, and his teeth gleamed white and sharp in the morning light. "So be it," he hissed, and his form began to shimmer and change, revealing itself as something far older and more terrible than any mortal man. The battle was brief but vicious, fought upon the swaying decks of ships, locked together by grappling hooks and the fury of combat. Prince Imrahil's sword sang as it clove through illusion and shadow, revealing the true nature of their enemies, creatures of mist and malice that had taken the forms of Gondor's soldiers to serve some darker purpose. When it was over, 3 empty ships drifted upon the current. Their crews vanished like mist before the sun. But the victory brought no satisfaction, only deeper questions and a growing certainty that the peril at Tol Brandir was far greater than any had imagined. As Numaramar resumed her course northward, Prince Imrahil stood at the rail, staring at the empty vessels that followed in their wake like ghosts. Whatever awaited them at the ancient isle, he now knew that they sailed not merely into mist and mystery, but into the very heart of a darkness that could wear the face of friend and foe alike. The wind freshened from the north, carrying with it the scent of rain and the distant thunder of the falls of Rauros, where the river plunged down from the heights in a torrent of foam and fury. And somewhere ahead, Lord Eristor rode toward his appointment with whatever power had awakened in the shadows of Tol Brandir. 3 days after the battle with the shadow ships, Numaramar approached the great lake of Nen Hithoel, where the waters of Anduin spread wide before gathering themselves for the mighty plunge over the falls of Rorod. Here the air grew thick with moisture, and strange vapors rose from the depths to dance like spirits in the pale sunlight. Prince Imrahil stood at the prow of his ship, his keen eyes searching the waters ahead for any sign of Lord Eristor's company. The shoreline had grown wild and desolate, marked only by ancient stones and the crumbling remnants of works built in elder days. Somewhere in the distance, the great pillars of the Argonath kept their eternal watch, though they were hidden now by the thickening mist that seemed to rise from the very bones of the earth. "My lord," called Sir Dervaran from his position near the mast, "the water grows strange here. See how it swirls and eddies, as if stirred by some great hand beneath the surface." Indeed, the surface of Nen Hithoel bore patterns that defied the natural flow of the current, spiraling whirls and racing lines that spoke of forces moving in the depths. Captain Círdan the Younger worked his steering oar with increasing difficulty, fighting currents that seemed to pull in all directions at once. "I like not the feel of this water," muttered the captain. "In all my years upon river and sea, I have never felt currents so willful. It is as if the lake itself opposes our passage, as if summoned by his words. A thick bank of mist began to rise from the center of the lake, spreading outward with unnatural speed. Within moments, Numaramar was enveloped in a gray shroud that muffled sound and confused the senses. The familiar landmarks vanished, and even the sun became no more than a pale disk in the overhead gloom. "All stop!" commanded Prince Imrahil, his voice carrying clearly through the strange silence that had fallen upon the water. "Drop anchor and wait. I would not have us blunder into the rocks of Tol Brandir through lack of caution." The crew moved swiftly to obey, their practiced hands finding the familiar tasks even in the bewildering mist. The great anchor splashed into the dark water, and Numaramar came to rest, swaying gently in the confused currents. But even as they waited for the mist to clear, sounds began to reach them through the gray veil, voices calling across the water, though whether in greeting or warning, none could say. The words seemed to come from all directions at once, echoing strangely, as if the mist itself had become a vast whispering gallery. "Do you hear that?" whispered Sir Galador, his young voice tight with suppressed fear. "It sounds like singing. but in no tongue I know." Prince Imrahil strained his ears, trying to make sense of the ethereal melody that seemed to weave itself through the mist, like golden thread through gray cloth. There was something hauntingly familiar about the tune, as if he had heard it long ago in dreams or in the songs of the sea wind that blew across the gardens of Dol Amroth. "It is Elvish," he said at last, his voice filled with wonder. "The high tongue of Valinor, though the words are too distant for me to understand. But see, the mist begins to part before us, as if the singing calls it away." Indeed, the gray veil was drawing back like curtains at a window, revealing first glimpses and then a clear view of Tol Brandir rising from the dark waters ahead. The ancient isle stood unchanged from the days when Isildur had looked upon it, its steep sides crowned with weathered stone and hardy trees that had grown there since the world was young. But something was different now. A soft light emanated from the summit of the isle, not the harsh glare of fire, but a gentle radiance that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the distant singing. And along the shoreline, Prince Imrahil could see figures moving, tall and graceful forms that gleamed like stars reflected in still water. "The firstborn," breathed Sir Dervarin. "Lord Erestor's company has indeed reached Tol Brandir before us. But what is that light upon the heights?" Even as he spoke, a new voice joined the ethereal chorus, deeper and more resonant than the others, carrying words that seemed to shake the very foundations of the isle. Prince Imrahil felt a chill run down his spine as he recognized the fell tongue of Mordor, though it was woven now with such skill and beauty that it seemed almost a prayer rather than a curse. "Something stirs within the ancient stones," he said quietly. "Captain, bring us closer to the isle, but with great caution. I would see what manner of power Lord Erestor has awakened with his song." Numaramar moved forward through the parting mist, her crew alert for any sign of danger. As they drew nearer to Tol Brandir, the details of the scene became clearer. Upon the narrow beach at the isle's foot, a circle of elven lords stood with their hands raised toward the summit, their voices raised in harmonious song. At their center stood a figure that could only be Lord Erestor himself, his silver circlet gleaming a strange light. But there was something wrong with the picture, something that made Prince Imrahil's warrior instincts prickle with unease. The elves stood too still, their poses too rigid, as if they were frozen in place by some force beyond their control. And their song, beautiful though it was, carried undertones of desperation and fear. "My lord," called out one of his knights from the ship's rail, "look there, upon the water, beyond the isle." Prince Imrahil turned his gaze northward and felt his blood turn to ice in his veins. 3 ships floated upon the dark water, their sails hanging limp and their decks apparently deserted. But these were not the shadow vessels they had encountered before. These bore the unmistakable lines of elven craft, graceful as swan and gleaming with the pale wood of Lothlorien. "The ships of Lord Erestor's company," he whispered. "But where are their crews? And why do they drift unmanned while their lords sing upon the shore?" The answer came with a sound that chilled the heart, a great voice speaking from the heights of Tol Brandir, in words that made the very air tremble with power and malice. Though the tongue was that of the elves, the will behind it was older and darker than the foundations of the world. "Long have I slept in the deeps of stone and memory," the voice intoned, each word echoing like thunder across the water. "Long have I waited for voices fair enough to wake me from my dreaming. Come, lords of the dying light, let your song give me form, let your power give me strength. The age of the elves fades, but I shall endure when the last star falls from the sky." Prince Imrahil felt the ancient dread of his Númenórean blood stirring in his veins, the same fear that had driven his ancestors to challenge the Valar themselves in their pride and folly. Here was a power from the depths of time, older than Sauron, older perhaps than Morgoth himself, one of the primordial forces that had shaped the world in its youth. "We must act," he said urgently, turning to his companion. "Whatever this entity is, it uses the elves' own song to give itself form and substance. If we do not intervene, It may break free of whatever bonds have held it through the long ages. But what can mortal men do against such power? Asked Sir Dervarine, his voice tight with strain. We are but gnats before the thunder of the storm. Prince Imrahil's hand moved to the silver horn that hung at his side, the great horn of Dol Amroth that had been wrought in the forges of Numenor and blessed by the sea kings of old. Perhaps, he said quietly, but even gnats may sometimes turn the tide of battle if they strike at the right moment. The voice from the heights rose again, and this time the very stones of Tol Brandir began to glow with eldritch fire. The elves' song grew more frantic, their rigid forms swaying like trees in a mighty wind. Whatever ritual they had begun, it was approaching its culmination. Prince Imrahil raised the horn to his lips and blew a blast that rang across the water like the voice of the sea itself, carrying in its silver notes all the pride and power of the Dunedain and their long struggle against the darkness. The effect was immediate and startling. The song of the elves faltered, their rigid poses relaxing as if invisible chains had been suddenly broken. Upon the heights of Tol Brandir, the strange light flickered and dimmed, and the great voice roared in fury and frustration. Now, shouted Prince Imrahil, while the spell is broken, to the shore, and let us see what manner of foe we face. Numaramar leaped forward through the water like a hunting hound, her crew pulling at the oars with desperate strength. Behind them, the mist began to thicken once more, as if whatever power dwelt within Tol Brandir sought to hide its true nature from mortal eyes. But Prince Imrahil had seen enough to know that the fate of Middle-earth might well hang in the balance of what transpired in the next few minutes. The voice from the ancient stones was rising again, and this time it sang not in Elvish, but in the Black speech, weaving words of power that made the very air crackle with malevolent energy. The battle for Tol Brandir was about to begin. The prow of Numaramar ground against the shingle beach of Tol Brandir with a sound like breaking bone, and Prince Imrahil leaped ashore before the ship had fully settled, his sword already singing from its sheath. Around him, his knights followed with the disciplined precision of warriors who had trained together through countless campaigns, their darkened mail and weather-beaten cloaks marking them as veterans of the Southern War. Upon the narrow beach, the elven lords stood swaying like trees in a gale, their faces marked by strain and a terror that seemed all the more shocking for appearing on features that had looked upon the light of the two trees. Lord Aristor himself stood at their center, his silver circlet askew, and his normally immaculate robes torn and stained with what looked like starlight given liquid form. "My lord!" called Prince Imrahil as he approached the circle of elves. "What manner of power have you awakened here? Speak quickly, for I fear we have little time." Aristor turned toward him with movements that seemed to require immense effort, as if he moved through water thick as honey. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of ages and the bitter taste of failure. "Prince of Dol Amroth," he gasped, each word a struggle against invisible bonds. "You should not have come. This is beyond the strength of mortal arms to resolve. We sought to bind what should never have been awakened, but our song has only given it greater power." From the heights of Tol Brandir came another thunderous roar, and the ancient stones themselves began to split and crack as something vast stirred within them. The strange light that had crowned the isle's peak now blazed like a fell star, casting weird shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. "Tell me what it is," demanded Prince Imrahil, grabbing Aristor by the shoulders and shaking him like a man waking from nightmare. "If we are to fight it, we must know its nature." "Morgamir," whispered the elf lord, and the name fell from his lips like a curse. "The forgotten shadow, the unnamed dread. It was bound here in the days before Gil-galad's crown was forged, when the world was young and the Valor still walked openly in Middle-earth. We hoped it was only legend, but the signs in star and stone told us otherwise." Sir Dervarine had approached close enough to hear these words, and his face paled beneath his helm. "My lord, if this thing has slept since the elder days, what could have awakened it now?" "The ring?" said Aristor simply, and those two words carried more weight than volumes of lore. When the One Ring was destroyed in the fires of Mount Doom, the reverberations shook all the foundations of Arda. Ancient bindings were weakened, old powers stirred, and things that had slept in the deep places began to wake. Prince Imrahil felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mist rising from the dark waters. Then, this is our legacy from the War of the Ring. Victory over Sauron has awakened something worse. Not necessarily worse, replied Aristor, managing to straighten his back despite the invisible forces that sought to bend him to the earth, but older and in some ways more dangerous because it is less focused in its malice. Sauron sought to rule. Morgomir seeks only to unmake, to return all creation to the void from whence it came. A new sound joined the thunder from the heights, the grinding of stone against stone, as if the very bones of Tol Brandir were shifting and changing. Cracks appeared in the isle's ancient walls, and through them seeped a darkness that was more than mere absence of light. "The binding weakens," said one of Aristor's companions, a tall elf whose golden hair marked him as one of the Noldor. "Soon it will break free entirely, and then not all the powers of Valinor could contain it. Then we must strengthen the binding," said Prince Imrahil, with the calm certainty of one who had faced impossible odds before. "Tell me what must be done." Aristor looked at him with surprise, and something that might have been hope. "You would stand with us against this evil, but you are mortal, and the song magic of the elves is not yours to command." "Perhaps not," replied the prince, his hand moving to touch the ancient horn at his side. "But I carry the blood of Numenor, and my people were not without their own forms of power. What must I do?" Before Aristor could answer, the very air around them began to thicken and congeal, as if reality itself was being twisted into new and unnatural shapes. The mist that had surrounded Tol Brandir now pulsed with malevolent life, reaching out with tendrils that sought to wrap themselves around the defenders on the beach. "The ritual!" shouted Aristor above the growing roar of unleashed power. "We must complete the binding of the 7 circles. Each of us must take our place upon the ancient marks carved in the stone, and together we must weave a song of containment." Prince Imrahil looked around the beach and saw them now. 7 circles carved deep into the living rock, worn smooth by countless ages, but still clearly visible. 6 were already occupied by the elven lords, but the 7th stood empty, its ancient runes gleaming with invitation. "I am no singer," protested the prince. "How can I take part in your song magic?" "Not with voice alone," replied Aristor, his eyes brightening with sudden understanding. "The horn, the great horn of Dol Amroth, carries within it the power of the Sea Kings, the blessing of Ulmo himself. Its voice can serve as the 7th part of our harmony." Without hesitation, Prince Imrahil strode to the empty circle and took his place upon the carved stone. Immediately, he felt the ancient power that flowed through the rock like veins of silver fire, connecting him to his 6 companions and to something vast and eternal that dwelt beyond the circles of the world. "Now," cried Aristor, "sing, all of you. Sing of binding and holding, of chains that cannot be broken, and walls that cannot be breached. Let our voices be as anchors in the storm." The elven song rose again, but this time it was different, stronger, more focused, shot through with harmonies that spoke of courage in the face of despair. And when Prince Imrahil raised the horn to his lips and added its silver voice to the chorus, the very foundations of Tol Brandir shook with the power of their combined will. From the heights came a shriek of rage that shattered stone and split the air like thunder. The darkness that had been seeping through the cracks in the isle's walls was suddenly drawn back as if by invisible hands, and the baleful light that had crowned the peak began to dim. But Morgomir was far from defeated. With a sound like the breaking of worlds, the ancient entity hurled its full power against the bonds that held it, and the 7 defenders felt their song falter under the assault. Prince Imrahil tasted blood in his mouth and realized that his very life force was being drawn into the binding. offered up as fuel for the spell that held the unnamed dread at bay. "Hold fast!" shouted Aristor, though his own voice was growing thin with strain. "The binding takes hold. A little longer, and it will sleep again for another age." Through the mist and shadow, Prince Imrahil could see his knights standing ready with drawn sword, though they could do nothing against an enemy made of living darkness and ancient malice. Their presence alone was a comfort, a reminder that he did not face this evil entirely alone. The horn grew hot in his hands, its silver surface beginning to glow with inner fire. He could feel the strength draining from his limbs, but still he held his place in the circle and poured all his will into the simple act of standing firm against the darkness. And gradually, slowly, the rage from the heights began to subside. The cracks in Tol Brandir's walls sealed themselves with light that was older than the sun, and the malevolent presence that had stirred in the deep places settled back into the sleep of ages. When at last the song ended and the 7 circles went dark, Prince Imrahil swayed upon his feet and would have fallen if not for Sir Dervarin's steady hand upon his arm. Around him, the elven lords looked as if they had aged a century in as many minutes, their bright eyes dimmed with exhaustion and their proud heads bowed with the weight of what they had wrought. "It is done," whispered Lord Aristor, and his voice carried both triumph, terrible weariness. "Morgomir sleeps again, bound by songs that will not fail while the world endure." But even as he spoke these words of comfort, Prince Imrahil noticed that one of the 7 circles remained faintly glowing, its ancient runes pulsing with a rhythm like a sleeping heartbeat. The binding was strong, but it was not perfect, and somewhere in the depths of Tol Brandir, something dark and patient began to count the years until the next chance to break free would come. Dawn broke gray and cheerless over Nen Hithoil, its pale light revealing the full cost of the night's work. Tol Brandir still rose from the dark waters like a great tooth of stone, but its aspect had changed. Where once the ancient isle had seemed merely weathered by time, now it bore visible scars, great cracks that ran down its flanks like tears, and patches of stone that gleamed with an oily iridescence that hurt the eyes to look upon. Prince Imrahil sat heavily upon a piece of driftwood that the receding mist had left upon the beach, his face pale with exhaustion, and the horn of Dol Amroth lying silent across his knees. The silver had dimmed to the color of tarnished pewter, and along its length ran hairline fractures that spoke of stresses beyond what mortal craft was meant to endure. "The horn is damaged," he said quietly to Sir Dervarin, who knelt beside him checking for injuries. "I can feel it. The power that once flowed through it, like a living thing, has diminished. Perhaps it gave too much of itself in the binding." Lord Aristor approached with steps that betrayed his own weariness, though the elf lord maintained his composure with the dignity of his kind. His silver circlet sat properly upon his brow once more, but Prince Imrahil noticed that several of the gems that had adorned it were now dark and lifeless. "The horn is not the only thing that has paid a price this night," said Aristor gently. "Look around you, Prince of Dol Amroth, and see what our victory has cost." Indeed, the signs of sacrifice were everywhere. Of the 7 elven ships that had brought Lord Aristor's company to Tol Brandir, only 3 remained floating upon the water. The others had simply faded, their substance drawn into the great binding like fuel consumed in a furnace. And of the elven lords themselves, 2 were gone entirely, not dead, but translated beyond the circles of the world, their very being woven the spells that held Morgomir at bay. "Glorfindel of Rivendell and Aragon of the Grey Haven," said Aristor, following Prince Imrahil's gaze to the empty spaces where his companions had stood. They volunteered to anchor the binding with their own essence, knowing that it would mean leaving Middle-earth forever. Their sacrifice has bought us perhaps 1,000 years of peace. Prince Imrahil bowed his head in respect for the fallen, though a part of his mind rebelled against the mathematics of the exchange. 2 immortal beings, vessels of wisdom and beauty, accumulated over long ages, traded for a mere millennium of safety. What would happen when that time was spent and Morgomir stirred again? "You read my thoughts in my face," observed Aristor with something that might have been a smile. Yes, this is but a temporary victory. But consider, without our intervention, the unnamed dread would have broken free entirely. Middle-earth would have faced a shadow darker than Sauron ever cast, and there would have been no binding at all. Small comfort to those who must face this evil again when their time comes, replied Prince Imrahil. What will you tell the lords of Rivendell when you return? How will you explain that 2 of their finest are gone forever? I will tell them the truth, said Aristor simply. That evil was held at bay by sacrifice freely given, and that the choice was made with full knowledge of its cost. Glorfindel himself spoke the words of volunteering, though he knew it meant leaving behind the light of Eldamar forever. Sir Dervarine, who had been examining the strange marks left by the knights working, suddenly called out in alarm, "My lord, come quickly and see this!" Prince Imrahil rose to his feet with an effort, his muscles protesting after the ordeal of channeling ancient powers through his mortal frame. Following Dervarine's pointing finger, he saw what had caught the knight's attention: footprints in the sand, leading away from the 7 circles toward the water's edge. But these were not the prints of any boot or shoe. They were bare feet, but feet that bore 6 toes instead of 5, and the marks they left glowed with a faint phosphorescence that made the surrounding sand seem ordinary and lifeless. Someone else was here, said Dervarin grimly. Someone who witnessed the binding, but chose to remain hidden while we fought for our lives. Lord Aristor knelt beside the tracks, his ancient eyes studying their shape and spacing with the intensity of a hunter reading sign. When he rose, his face was troubled by more than mere weariness. "These are not the footprints of any child of Eru," he said quietly. "The gait is wrong, the proportion. No, this is something older and stranger. One of the Uvanimo, perhaps, the unwilling ones who refused the music in the beginning and have wandered the dark places ever since." "You speak in riddles," said Prince Imrahil, though he felt a chill at the alien nature of the tracks. "What are these unwilling ones, and why would one have come here?" "Legend tells of beings who existed before the valor shaped the world as we know it," replied Aristor. "Creatures of will and shadow who rejected the harmony of creation and sought instead to remake all things according to their own desires. Most were bound or banished in the early days, but some few escaped into the forgotten places of the earth. The implications of this revelation settled upon the group like a shroud. If one of these ancient beings had witnessed the binding of Morgomir, what knowledge might it carry away, and to what purpose would such knowledge be put? "The tracks lead to the water," observed Sir Dervarin. "Whatever it was, it departed by sea. But in what vessel? We saw no other ships upon the lake." "The Uvanimo need no ships," said Aristor darkly. "They can take many forms, or none at all as suits their purpose. This one could be anywhere by now, perhaps already bearing word of our work to others of its kind." Prince Imrahil felt the weight of new responsibilities settling upon his shoulders. It was not enough to have bound the evil that slept beneath Tol Brandir. Now they must also concern themselves with who else might know of the binding, and what use they might make of that knowledge. "We must return to Minas Tirith at once," he decided. "Lord Denethor must know of what has transpired here, and preparations must be made against whatever consequences may flow from this night's work." "Aye," agreed Aristor, "and I must bear word to Master Elrond, though it grieves me to tell him of the price that was paid. The wise must take counsel together, for this matter touches upon powers that predate all our accumulated lore." As the group prepared to depart from Tol Brandir's haunted shore, Prince Imrahil cast one last look at the ancient isle. In daylight, it seemed almost normal again, just another rocky outcrop in the wide waters of Nen Hithoel. But he knew that beneath its weathered stones, something dark and patient waited for its chance to wake once more. The mist that had shrouded the lake was beginning to dissipate, revealing the distant pillars of the Argonath standing eternal watch over the gates of Gondor. Soon those ancient kings would see the return of a company much reduced, bearing news that would trouble the halls of power and set in motion events that none could foresee. Behind them, the strange footprints were already beginning to fade, washed away by the lapping waters of the lake. But the memory of their alien shape would linger long in the minds of those who had seen them, a reminder that Middle-earth still held secrets darker and older than any they had yet imagined. The wind picked up from the south, filling the sails of the surviving ships and carrying them away from Tol Brandir toward whatever destiny awaited in the courts of kings and the councils of the wise. The great bell of Minas Tirith rang out across the Pelennor field as Prince Imrahil's ship approached the quays of the Harland, its bronze voice carrying news of arrival to all who heard it. But there was no joy in the sound, only the grave solemnity that befitted tidings of both victory and loss. Word had gone ahead by swift messenger, and Lord Denethor waited in his high chamber with Captain Boromir at his side, their faces marked by the strain of uncertainty. Prince Imrahil climbed the winding ways of the White City with weary steps, still feeling the lingering effects of the power that had flowed through him during the binding. The horn of Dol Amroth hung silent at his side, its cracked surface a visible reminder of the price that had been paid at Tol Brandir. Behind him walked Sir Dervarin and the remainder of his company, their weapons and armor bearing the stains of their encounter with forces beyond mortal understanding. In the hall of the fountain, Lord Denethor received them with the formal courtesy due to returning heroes, but his keen eyes missed nothing of their diminished numbers or the hollow look that marked all who had gazed upon the unnamed dread. When the ritual greetings were complete and wine had been poured for the weary travelers, he gestured for Prince Imrahil to take the seat of honor at his right hand. "Speak," commanded the steward simply. "Tell me of what you found at Tol Brandir and what it cost to deal with." Prince Imrahil's account was thorough and precise, omitting nothing of what they had witnessed or done. He spoke of the false ships that had barred their way, of the mist that rose from the ancient waters, of the song that had bound Morgomir in his prison of stone. When he came to the sacrifice of the two elven lords, his voice grew heavy with grief and respect. Glorfindel and Aragon gave their very existence to strengthen the binding, he concluded. Without their sacrifice, I do not believe our efforts would have succeeded. They are gone from Middle-earth forever, translated into the stuff of the spells that hold the unnamed dread at bay. Denethor sat in silence for a long moment, his fingers steepled before him as he pondered the implications of what he had heard. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of kingship and the burden of decisions that would affect generations yet unborn. 1,000 years, he mused. It seems a great span to mortal men, yet in the life of the world, it is but a season. What provision have we made for those who must face this evil when our time is spent? Lord Erestor spoke of records to be kept and knowledge to be preserved, replied Prince Imrahil. The wise will take counsel together, and perhaps they will find ways to strengthen the binding or to prepare better defenses when the time comes. The wise, repeated Denethor, and there was a note in his voice that spoke of old frustrations and hidden pain. Ever they plan for the long years, while we who are mortal must deal with the present crisis. But tell me of these strange footprints you found. What manner of being could have witnessed your work without revealing itself? Prince Imrahil described the alien tracks and Lord Erestor's words about the Uvanimo, watching as understanding and concern warred in the steward's expression. It was Captain Boromir who broke the silence that followed, his young voice sharp with warrior's instinct. If such a being carries knowledge of the binding to others of its kind, might they not seek to use that knowledge against us? Perhaps even to weaken the spells that hold this Morgomir in check? That is my fear, admitted Prince Imrahil. Lord Erestor seemed most troubled by the implication, though he spoke little of what specific dangers we might face. Denethor rose from his chair and moved to the great window that looked out over the Pelennor toward the river Anduin. His hands clasped behind his back, he stood gazing northward toward the distant reaches where Tol Brandir kept its lonely vigil. Then we must prepare for the possibility that our enemies know as much as we do about this ancient evil, he said at last, and we must be ready to act if the binding shows signs of weakening before its time. My lord, ventured Sir Derverine, speaking for the first time since entering the hall. "There is another matter that troubles. The false ships we encountered bore perfect imitations of Gondor's banners and bore crews that seemed human until revealed for what they truly were. If our enemies can send such deceptions among us, how are we to know friend from foe?" Denethor turned from the window, his piercing gaze falling upon the young knight. "You speak wisdom beyond your years, Sir Derverine. Indeed, this may prove the greater danger in the days to come. If shapeshifters and deceivers walk among us, then we must look to our defenses not only against open assault, but against corruption from within." The great doors of the hall opened with a sound like thunder, and a messenger entered bearing the white rod of urgent tiding. He approached the steward's chair with the swift stride of one who had ridden hard and far, his cloak still damp with the morning mist of the riverlands. "My lord," he said, dropping to one knee before Denethor's seat, "word comes from Captain Faramir at Ithilien. Strange lights have been seen, moving along the eastern borders, and the rangers report sounds of digging in the night. It may be that the enemy seeks to tunnel beneath our defenses." Prince Imrahil felt a chill that had nothing to do with the stone walls of the citadel. "My lord, the timing of this news troubles me greatly. If the Uvanimo truly carry word of what transpired at Tol Brandir, might they not be seeking to coordinate their efforts with our known enemies?" "The same thought had occurred to me," replied Denethor grimly. "Captain Boromir, take a company of your choosing and ride to Ithilien at once. Reinforce your brother's position and investigate these reports of digging. If the enemy seeks to undermine our borders, we must know the full extent of their plans." "Yes, father," replied Boromir, his hand moving instinctively to his sword. "But what of the watchers upon Anduin? Should we not also strengthen the river guard in case these shapeshifters attempt further deception?" "Indeed," agreed Denethor. "Prince Imrahil, despite your recent ordeal, I must ask for your aid once more. Return to Dol Amroth and marshal your fleet. If enemies move upon the water, we must be ready to meet them with steel and fire." "Please." As the various lords and captains prepared to depart upon their missions, Lord Erestor entered the hall with the silent grace of his people. The elf lord bore visible signs of his ordeal. His robes were travel-stained, his face marked by weariness that went deeper than mere physical exhaustion. But his eyes still held the light of the elder days, undimmed by all that he had endured. "Lord Denethor," he said with the formal courtesy of one highborn addressing another, "I come to take my leave ere I return to Rivendell. But first, I would speak words of counsel regarding the events at Tol Brandir." "Speak freely, Lord Erestor," replied Denethor. "Your wisdom is welcome in these halls, as it has been since the days of my father. The binding we have wrought is strong, but it is not without weaknesses," said Erestor carefully. "Chief among these is that it relies upon the continued existence of Tol Brandir itself. Should the isle be destroyed or significantly altered, the spells that hold Morgomir might be disrupted." The implications of this revelation fell upon the assembled company like a weight of stone. If their enemies understood this weakness, they might seek to destroy Tol Brandir rather than attempting to wake what slept beneath it. "Then we must guard the isle as we would guard Minas Tirith itself," declared Denethor. "But how does one defend a rocky outcrop in the middle of a great lake? We cannot build walls upon its heights or station armies upon its shores." "There are ways," replied Erestor, "but they would require the cooperation of powers beyond the reach of mortal kings. I must take counsel with Master Elrond and with the Lady Galadriel, if she can be reached in her distant realm. Perhaps together we can devise wards that do not depend upon mortal guards or stone fortifications." As the sun set behind the mountains and torches were lit in the hall, the various preparations for the trials ahead took shape. Messages would go forth to every corner of Gondor and beyond, calling for vigilance against enemies both known and unknown. The great game of kings and powers had begun a new phase, with stakes higher than any had dared imagine. But in the deep places beneath Tol Brandir, something stirred in its sleep and dreamed of freedom, counting the days until its moment would come again. 3 weeks after the council in Minas Tirith, Captain Faramir crouched in the shadow of a fallen oak tree, On the borders of Ithilien, his rangers spread out in a protective screen around his position. The autumn night was clear and cold, with stars blazing overhead like scattered diamonds. But the beauty of the evening was lost on the men who watched the darkness with weapons ready and hearts filled with foreboding. "There," whispered Mablung, the eldest of the rangers, his weathered hand pointing toward a cluster of broken stones that had once been part of some ancient monument. "Do you see the light moving beneath the ground?" Indeed, a faint phosphorescence could be seen seeping up between the cracks in the earth, pulsing with the same alien rhythm they had observed for the past fortnight. Whatever worked beneath the soil of Ithilien moved with purpose and intelligence, following patterns that spoke of design rather than random destruction. "How deep do you judge them to be?" asked Faramir quietly, his keen eyes studying the subtle signs that betrayed the presence of the unseen diggers. "Perhaps 20 feet, maybe more," replied Anborn, another of the veteran rangers. "They follow the old watercourses, the ones that were diverted when the great works were built in the days of the kings. It's almost as if they know the ancient geography better than we do ourselves." This observation troubled Faramir more than he cared to admit. The rangers of Ithilien were descended from men who had guarded these borders for generations. Their knowledge of every stone and stream passed down from father to son. If these invaders possessed greater understanding of the land's secrets, it suggested enemies far older and more knowledgeable than any they had faced before. A new sound joined the subtle scraping that had become all too familiar. Voices calling in the darkness, speaking words in a tongue that seemed to twist and writhe like living things. The language was utterly alien, bearing no resemblance to the black speech of Mordor or any of the debased tongues that Sauron's servants had. "Captain," said Damrod, the youngest of the rangers, his voice tight with barely controlled fear, "that speech makes my skin crawl. It's as if the very words seek to burrow into my mind and make a nest there." Faramir nodded grimly, feeling the same unnatural revulsion that plagued all his men when they heard the alien voices. There was something in that speech that was fundamentally wrong, as if it violated the very principles upon which language and thought were built. "Signal the retreat," he commanded quietly. "We have learned what we came to learn, and there is little more to be gained by remaining here. Let us return to the hidden camp and make our report." The rangers withdrew with the silent skill of their training, leaving no trace of their presence, save the faintest disturbance in the fallen leaves. As they made their way through the moonlit forest, Faramir's mind raced through the implications of what they had observed. The digging had begun immediately after the events at Tol Brandir, suggesting a connection that could not be mere coincidence. Whatever these creatures were, they possessed knowledge of the ancient evil that had been bound beneath the lonely isle, and they worked with the urgency of those who saw opportunity in the temporary weakness that followed such great expenditures of power. At the hidden camp, deep in the heart of Ithilien, where no fire was permitted and even whispered conversations were discouraged, Faramir composed his report to his father. The words came slowly, for how could mere letters convey the alien wrongness of what they had witnessed? "My lord," he wrote by the light of a shielded lantern, "the enemy beneath our borders is not of any race we have encountered before. Their speech hurts the mind to hear, and their knowledge of these lands exceeds our own. I fear they are not merely seeking to tunnel beneath our defenses, but are following some deeper purpose that connects to the events at Tol Brandir." He paused in his writing, considering whether to include his growing suspicion that these invaders were the same beings that had left their alien footprints upon the shores of the ancient isle. The evidence was circumstantial at best, but the timing and the strangeness of both encounters suggested a pattern that could not be ignored. "There is more," he continued. "The tunnels they dig do not lead toward our fortifications as I first supposed, but rather follow the ancient watercourses northward, as if they seek to reach the great river itself. If this is their goal, then perhaps their true target is not Ithilien at all, but something that lies beyond our borders." The implications of this possibility were staggering. If these alien diggers sought to reach Anduin, they could follow the river's course all the way to Nen Hithuel and the vicinity of Tol Brandir. Were they perhaps seeking to approach the bound evil from below, through channels that bypassed the watchers on the surface? A soft rustling in the undergrowth brought Faramir's attention back to the immediate present. Mablung appeared at the edge of the small clearing, his face grim with news that would clearly bring no comfort. "Captain," he said quietly, "Anborn has returned from the Northern Watch. He brings word that the digging has reached the banks of the Anduin, and something has emerged from the tunnels during the night." Faramir set down his pen and reached for his sword, the familiar weight of the blade a comfort in these uncertain times. What manner of something? "He saw it only briefly, and from a great distance," replied Mablung, "but he described a figure tall as an elf lord, but wrong in its proportions, as if someone had carved a statue from memory and gotten the details subtly incorrect. It stood upon the riverbank for perhaps an hour, seeming to test the current and the depth of the water, and then it waded into the stream and vanished beneath the surface. Anborn waited until dawn, but it did not emerge again." Faramir felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn night. If these beings could survive beneath the waters of Anduin, they possessed capabilities that made them even more dangerous opposed. The great river was deep and swift, its currents treacherous to even the most skilled swimmers. Yet this creature had entered it as casually as a man might step into a shallow pool. "Assemble the men," he commanded. "We ride for Minas Tirith at once. This news cannot wait for the regular messenger service." As the rangers prepared to depart their hidden camp, none of them noticed the pair of pale eyes that watched from the depths of a thorny thicket. The watcher remained motionless until the last sound of their passage had faded, then emerged to reveal a form that was indeed tall as an elf lord, but wrong in every detail. Its limbs were too long, its joints bent at angles that should have been impossible for any creature of flesh and bone. The face that should have been fair was instead a mockery of beauty, with features that seemed to shift and flow like water whenever direct observation became too intense. The creature that had once been called by many names in the deep places of the world raised its voice in a call that was not quite song and not quite speech, but something that partook of both and transcended the limitations of either. From the tunnels beneath the earth came answering calls, and soon a dozen similar figures had emerged to stand upon the banks of the ancient river. Together, they waded into the swift current of Anduin, their alien forms disappearing beneath the surface as they began the long journey northward toward their ultimate destination. Behind them, the tunnels they had dug began to collapse, erasing all evidence of their presence, save for the strange phosphorescence that would continue to seep from the disturbed earth for years to come. In the depths of the great river, the Uvanimo swam with the tireless persistence of their kind, following currents both seen and unseen toward the place where ancient evil waited to be freed from its bond. They carried with them knowledge gathered in the deep places and plans conceived in malice, older than the foundations of the world. The race for Tol Brandir had begun in earnest, though not all the participants yet understood the true nature of the game they played. The great bell of Minas Tirith tolled the midnight hour as Captain Faramir rode through the gates of the citadel, his horse lathered with sweat, and his cloak torn by the branches of trees passed too swiftly in the darkness. Behind him rode a dozen of his finest rangers, their faces grim with the urgency of their mission and the weight of the tidings they bore. In the highest tower of the White City, Lord Denethor waited in his private chamber, having been roused from fitful sleep by the arrival of his younger son. The steward had not rested well since receiving word of the events at Tol Brandir, and the lines of care upon his face had deepened with each passing day. Beside him stood Captain Boromir, recently returned from his own mission to the eastern border. "Father," said Faramir without preamble as he entered the chamber, still bearing the dust of hard travel upon his clothes, "the situation in Ithilien has taken a turn for the worse. The creatures that tunnel beneath our borders are not seeking to undermine our defenses. They make for the great river itself, and I fear their ultimate destination is Tol Brandir." Denethor's eyes sharpened with alarm, and he gestured for his son to take a seat near the flickering brazier that provided warmth against the autumn chill. Tell me everything you have observed, and spare no detail, however strange it might seem." Faramir's account was thorough and precise, describing the alien speech that hurt the mind to hear, the impossible anatomy of the creature that had entered Anduin, and the systematic collapse of the tunnels that suggested careful planning rather than hasty retreat. "How many of these beings do you estimate have entered the river?" asked Boromir when his brother had finished speaking. "At least a dozen that we observed directly," replied Faramir, "but there may have been others that avoided our notice. The tunnels they dug were extensive, branching and rebranching like the roots of some great tree. They could have been moving large numbers beneath the earth, without our knowledge." Denethor rose from his chair and moved to the great window that looked out over the sleeping city, toward the northern reaches, where Anduin flowed through the heart of Gondor. His hands clasped behind his back, he stood in silent contemplation for a long moment before speaking. "If these creatures can travel beneath the water as easily as upon the land, then they possess capabilities we are ill-equipped to counter," he said at last. "Our river wardens are skilled at detecting ships and rafts, but what man can guard against enemies that swim like fish in the depths?" "There may be a way," said a new voice from the doorway, and all three men turned to see Prince Imrahil entering the chamber with the quiet grace that marked his noble bearing. The Prince of Dol Amroth looked travel-worn but determined, his sea-gray cloak still damp with spray from the river journey that had brought him north with all speed. "Prince Imrahil," said Denethor with genuine warmth, "I had not expected your return so soon. What news from the southern fiefs?" "The fleets of Dol Amroth are mobilized and ready, my lord," replied Imrahil, "but more importantly, I bring word from an unexpected source, the Sea Ward Elves, who dwell in the hidden harbors along the coast. They have felt the disturbance in the waters and offer their aid in tracking these aquatic invaders." Faramir leaned forward with interest. "The Sea Ward Elves? I thought they had departed Middle-earth with the last ships from the Grey Havens." "Not all of them," replied Prince Imrahil. "Some few remained behind, bound to the sea by ties too strong to break. They rarely meddle in the affairs of men, but the presence of the Uvanimo in the waters has stirred them to action. They know these ancient beings of old, and they fear what their presence might portend." "What do they offer?" asked Denethor bluntly. "Ships that can sail beneath the water as well as upon it, and crews whose sight can pierce the deepest currents to track the movement of our enemies. They ask no payment save the right to face the Uvanimo in open battle, for there are old grievances between their peoples that date back to the music of creation itself." The prospect of such unexpected aid brought the first glimmer of hope that any of them had felt since the binding at Tol Brandir. But Denethor's expression remained cautious, for he had learned through long years of rule that gifts too eagerly offered often came with hidden costs. "What surety do we have that these Sea Ward Elves are truly what they claim to be?" he asked. "We have already encountered enemies that could take fair forms and speak with convincing voices. How do we know that this is not another deception?" Prince Imrahil had anticipated this question, and he drew from his robes a small crystal vial filled with water that seemed to hold captured starlight within its depth. "They gave me this as a token of their good faith. Water from the fountain of Nimrodel, blessed in the days when the world was young." Lord Aristor examined it ere he departed for Rivendell and confirmed its authenticity. Denethor took the vial and held it up to the light, watching as the liquid within swirled with patterns that seemed to echo the dance of stars across the night sky. Even to his mortal senses, the water radiated a sense of peace and ancient power that no servant of darkness could have counterfeited. "Very well," he said at last. "When can these allies be ready to act?" "They await only word from us," replied Prince Imrahil. "Their ships lie hidden in the sea caves beneath the Dol Amroth headland, ready to enter Anduin and begin the hunt. But they warn that time grows short. The Uvanimo move with purpose and speed that suggests they know something we do not." Captain Boromir, who had been listening with growing frustration, finally spoke up. "While we debate and plan, our enemies swim ever closer to their goal. Why do we not strike at them directly? Surely mortal steel can harm these creatures, however strange their nature. Perhaps, agreed Prince Imrahil, but remember that these beings are older than the foundations of Gondor, versed in arts that were ancient when Gil-galad wore his crown. Direct assault may not be the wisest course when dealing with such foe. As if summoned by the mention of ancient name, a new presence made itself known in the chamber, not by sight or sound, but by a sudden chill that seemed to emanate from the very stones of the citadel. The candles flickered as if touched by an unfelt wind, and shadows gathered in corners where no shadows should have been. "Someone walks the halls who should not be here," said Denethor quietly, his hand moving to rest upon the palantir that lay concealed beneath a cloth of silver. "The wards of the citadel have been breached by something that does not belong in the world of the living." Even as he spoke, footsteps could be heard approaching along the corridor outside, footsteps that fell with the measured pace of one who walks without haste or fear of discovery. But there was something wrong with the sound, a hollow quality that suggested the feet that made them were not quite solid, not quite real. The door to the chamber swung open without any hand touching it, revealing a figure that made all four men reach instinctively for their weapons. It stood tall as a man, but moved with the fluid grace of something that had never known the limitations of flesh and bone. Its features were hidden beneath a hood of midnight blue, but pale light gleamed where eyes should have been. "Peace," said the figure in a voice like wind through winter trees. "I come not as enemy, but as harbinger. The time of choosing approaches, and you must decide whether you will stand with the light or be consumed by the shadow that rises from the depths." "See, who are you?" demanded Denethor, though his voice remained steady despite the supernatural dread that filled the chamber. "I am one who has walked between the worlds since the first song was sung," replied the figure. "In your tongue, you might call me a Maya. Though I have worn many forms and answered to many names, I bring warning from those who watch from afar. The binding at Tol Brandir weakens more swiftly than was foreseen." The revelation struck the assembled men like a physical blow. If the great binding was failing ahead of schedule, then all their preparations might be for naught. "How long do we have?" asked Prince Imrahil, his warrior's mind already calculating possibilities and necessities. "Perhaps a month, perhaps less," replied the mysterious messenger. "The Uvanimo know secrets of unbinding that were hidden from the wise when the spell was wrought. Even now they gather at the roots of Tol Brandir, singing songs of dissolution in tongues that predate the creation of the world." "Then we must stop them," declared Boromir fiercely. "Whatever the cost, we cannot allow this ancient evil to be freed." The hooded figure turned toward him, and though its face remained hidden, there was something like approval in its stance, spoken like a true heir of Numenor. "But know this, the battle that comes will not be won by sword and shield alone. It will require sacrifice of a kind that mortal men have rarely been asked to make." "What manner of sacrifice?" asked Denethor, though his voice suggested he already suspected the answer. "That remains to be seen," replied the figure, already beginning to fade like morning mist touched by the sun. "But remember, in the deepest darkness, even the smallest light can drive back the shadow. Choose well, lords of Gondor, for the fate of all Middle-earth may hang upon your decisions." And with that cryptic warning, the mysterious messenger vanished entirely, leaving behind only the lingering scent of sea wind and the memory of words that would echo in their minds through all the trials to come. Outside the window, the first pale light of dawn began to touch the peaks of the Efelduath, heralding the beginning of what might be the last day of peace that Middle-earth would know for a very long time. Dawn came gray and cold to the harbors of Dol Amroth, where strange ships rode at anchor in the protected waters of the sea caves that honeycombed the coastal cliffs. These vessels bore little resemblance to the craft of mortal men. Their hulls seemed to be wrought from pearl and silver, and their sails shimmered with colors that had no names in any earthly tongue. Upon their decks stood figures of ethereal beauty, their eyes holding the depth of ocean depths and the wisdom of ages. Prince Imrahil stood upon the quay carved from living rock, watching as the seaward elves made their final preparations for the journey up Anduin. At his side stood Captain Círdan the Younger, his weathered face marked by wonder as he observed craft that could sail beneath the waves as easily as upon their surface. "Never in all my years upon the water have I seen their like," murmured the captain. "How do ships of pearl and starlight navigate the muddy currents of the great river?" "The same way that songs can bind ancient evils and words can shape the stuff of creation," replied Prince Imrahil. "There are powers in the world that transcend the understanding of mortal men, and we would be wise to accept their aid gratefully, rather than questioning the means by which it is offered." Viti, the leader of the seaward elves, approached with the fluid grace of his kind, his pale robes seeming to flow like captured moonlight around his tall form. He was ancient, even by the standards of the firstborn, his silver hair touched with the green of deep waters, and his eyes holding memory that stretched back to the earliest days of Arda. "Lord Mithrelus greets the Prince of Dol Amroth," he said in the formal manner of the Eldar, his voice carrying the music of distant shores. "The ships of the Hidden Haven are ready to begin the hunt, but we would speak words of counsel ere we depart these friendly waters." "Speak freely, Lord Mithrelus," replied Prince Imrahil. "Your wisdom is welcome, especially in matters touching upon these ancient foes." The elf lord's expression grew grave as he considered his word. "The Uvanimo are not merely creatures of flesh and spirit, as are the children of Eru. They are fragments of the discord that existed before the music brought harmony to creation. To face them is to confront chaos itself, and many who do so find their minds shattered by the experience. Are you saying that mortal men cannot hope to stand against them?" "Not at all," replied Mithrelus, "but you must understand that this battle will be fought as much in the realm of will and spirit as in the world of sword and steel. The Uvanimo seek to spread their fundamental wrongness to all they touch, corrupting the very foundations of order and meaning. To resist them, you must hold fast to what you know to be true and good, even when reality itself seems to waver around you." Prince Imrahil nodded soberly, filing this warning away with all the others he had received. "What of the binding at Tol Brandir? Can your people sense its condition from here?" Lord Mithrelus closed his eyes and extended his senses northward, his consciousness touching the currents of power that flowed through the deep places of the world. When he opened them again, his expression was troubled. "The binding whole, but it is under constant assault," he reported. "The Uvanimo sing their songs of dissolution without cease, wearing away at the spells like water, wearing away stone. If they are not stopped soon, the ancient evil will break free regardless of any other considerations." "Then we must not delay," said Prince Imrahil decisively. "How swiftly can your ships travel upstream against the current of Anduin?" "Swifter than any vessel wrought by mortal hands," replied the elf lord. "We shall reach the waters of Nen Hithoil while the sun still stands high in the western sky. But know this, once we enter the realm where the Uvanimo work their corruption, we may not be able to return. The very water may become poisoned against us." "I understand the risk," said Prince Imrahil, "but if we do not take it, there may be no Middle-earth left to return to." As the strange fleet prepared to depart the hidden harbors, messengers arrived from Minas Tirith bearing word from Lord Denethor. The steward had mobilized every available resource in Gondor's arsenal. The swan ships of Dol Amroth would converge on Nen Hithul from the south, while companies of rangers and soldiers would march overland to secure the shores around Tol Brandir. But even these preparations seemed inadequate when measured against the magnitude of the threat they faced. How could mortal armies hope to contain an evil that had slumbered since the world was young? What weapons could prevail against beings that existed outside the normal order of creation? The answer came from an unexpected source as the fleet of pearl and silver ships began their journey up the great river. A lone figure waited on the banks of Anduin, where the river curved past the ancient watchtowers of Gondor. Tall and fair, with starlight in his hair, and the authority of ages in his bearing. "Lord Elrond," breathed Prince Imrahil in amazement as he recognized the Master of Rivendell. "But how came you here so swiftly? We had no word of your departure from the Hidden Valley." "The straight road is swifter than the winding ways of Middle-earth for those who know its secrets," replied Elrond simply. "I come bearing aid from the White Council and carrying artifacts that may prove useful in the trials ahead." He gestured to a small boat that waited nearby, its hull carved from a single piece of white wood and inlaid with mithril that caught the morning light like captured stars. Within it lay objects of power that made the very air shimmer with contained energy. The ancient blade, Orcrit, thought lost in the halls of the Lonely Mountain, a horn of ivory that had once sounded the charge at the Battle of 5 Armies, and a small crystal phial that seemed to hold the light of Arundel's star. These were hidden away after the last alliance, preserved against a day when they might be needed again, explained Elrond as he stepped aboard one of the elven ships. The blade was reforged in the fires of Mount Doom itself during Sauron's defeat, quenched in water from the Mirrormere and blessed with songs of protection. The horn carries within it the courage of all who have sounded the call to battle against darkness. And the phial holds a light that was kindled before the world began, proof against all shadow and corruption. Prince Imrahil felt his spirits lift at the sight of these legendary weapons, but he could not shake the feeling that even such mighty artifacts might not be enough for the task ahead. The warning of the mysterious messenger still echoed in his mind. This battle would require sacrifice of a kind that mortal men had rarely been asked to make. As the combined fleet began its journey northward through the widening waters of Anduin, none of the defenders noticed the pale eyes that watched from the depths of the river. Far below the surface, the Uvanimo had felt the approach of their ancient enemies and were already preparing countermeasures that would test the resolve of all who sought to stand against them. The race for Tol Brandir had entered its final phase, and the outcome would determine whether the fourth age of Middle-earth would be one of peace and healing or of shadow and despair. In the deep places beneath the ancient isle, something that had slept for 3,000 years began to stir more restlessly. Sensing that the moment of its freedom drew near, the mist rose from Nen Hithoil like the breath of sleeping giants as the combined fleet approached the waters where Tol Brandir kept its lonely vigil. But this was not the natural vapor that had shrouded the lake in ages past. This mist writhed and twisted with malevolent purpose, reaching out with tendrils that sought to ensnare any vessel that dared to challenge its domain. Prince Imrahil stood at the prow of Lord Mithrelis's flagship, his hand resting upon the hilt of his sword as he watched the corrupted waters ahead. The great lake that had once reflected the glory of Gil-galad's host now showed only darkness, its surface broken by whirlpools that spun with unnatural persistence and waves that moved against the wind. "The Uvanimo have been busy," observed Lord Elrond grimly, his ancient eyes reading signs that were hidden from mortal sight. "They have not merely weakened the binding, they have begun to reshape the very essence of this place, turning it into a reflection of their own disordered nature." Around them, the ships of the Sea-Ward elves cut through the polluted water with hulls that gleamed like captured moonlight, their crews singing in harmony to counter the discord that sought to drag them down into the depths. But even their ancient songs seemed strained against the weight of corruption that pressed upon them from all sides. "There," called Captain Círdan from his position at the steering oar, pointing toward the looming bulk of Tol Brandir. "Do you see the lights that dance around the isle's base? They mark the positions of our enemies." Indeed, phosphorescent shapes could be seen moving beneath the surface of the lake, circling the ancient rock like predators around wounded prey. The Uvanimo had gathered in great numbers, their alien forms creating patterns in the water that hurt the mind to follow. At their center, where the 7 circles of binding had been carved into Tol Brandir's shore, a great wound had opened in the fabric of reality itself. "The binding failed," whispered Lord Mithrelis, his normally composed features marked by horror at what he witnessed. "See how the ancient stones crack and bleed shadow? The spells that held Morgomir are unraveling like poorly woven cloth. From the depths of the wounded earth came a sound that was not quite music and not quite screaming, the voice of something vast and terrible stirring to wakefulness after an eon of enforced slumber. The sound struck the defenders like a physical blow, sending waves of nausea and despair through their ranks. "Hold fast!" commanded Prince Imrahil, raising his voice against the psychic assault. "Remember who you are and why you fight. Do not let their discord shake your resolve." But even as he spoke these words of encouragement, he felt his own certainty wavering under the influence of the Uvanimo's presence. Reality itself seemed to flutter like a banner in the wind, showing glimpses of worlds where light had never existed, and chaos reigned supreme over all creation. Lord Elrond raised the crystal phial that contained the light of Arundil's star, and its pure radiance cut through the gathering darkness like a blade of silver fire. Where its beams touched the corrupted water, the phosphorescent shapes of the Uvanimo writhed and retreated, their forms becoming less substantial in the presence of light that had been kindled before the world began. "Now," he called to the assembled fleet, "while the light holds them at bay, we must reach the shore and restore the binding before it fails entirely." The ships of the seaward elves leaped forward through the water like hunting wolves, their crews singing battle songs that had not been heard since the War of Wrath. Behind them came the swan ships of Dol Amroth, their mortal crews drawing courage from the example of their immortal allies. But the Uvanimo were not passive in their defense of the corruption they had wrought. Rising from the depths came forms that should not have existed, creatures of living shadow and crystallized discord that defied all natural law. They fell upon the approaching fleet with the fury of chaos itself, seeking to drag the defenders down into the abyssal darkness where sanity went to die. The battle that followed was unlike any that had been fought in all the long history of Middle-earth. Swords rang against claws of living darkness, while songs of power contended with screams that could shatter stone. Prince Imrahil found himself fighting beside beings of legend, his mortal blade somehow keeping pace with weapons forged in the light of the two trees. "The shore!" called Lord Mithrelus above the din of battle. "We must reach the circles of binding." Through gaps in the press of combat, Prince Imrahil could see their destination. The beach, where he had once stood in the circle of ancient power, now cracked and bleeding shadow from the wounds torn in reality itself. If they could reach those sacred stones and restore the binding, there might yet be hope. But between them and their goal stood a figure that made even the Uvanimo seem small and petty by comparison. Rising from the depths of Tol Brandir came Morgomir himself, not fully awakened, but stirring toward consciousness with each passing moment. His form was vast and terrible, a shadow given substance and malice given shape. And his voice, when he spoke, shook the very foundations of the world. 3,000 years have I waited for this moment, he intoned, his words carrying the weight of eons and the promise of universal dissolution. 3,000 years of dreaming of the day when I would unmake all that the music has wrought and return existence to the blessed void that came before. Lord Elrond raised Orcrist high above his head, the ancient blade blazing with light that had been kindled in the forges of Gondolin. "You shall not pass, creature of the void. The children of Eru stand against you, and their light shall not be quenched by your darkness." The duel that followed was fought on levels beyond the merely physical, a contest of wills that shook both earth and sky, while around them the battle raged between order and chaos, creation and dissolution. Prince Imrahil found himself swept along in currents of power that threatened to tear his mortal mind apart, sustained only by his faith in the rightness of their cause. Through the chaos of combat, he saw Lord Mithrelus and his warriors fighting their way toward the broken circles, carrying with them tools and artifacts that might serve to repair the ancient binding. But they were few against many, and the Uvanimo pressed them hard with weapons of living shadow and words of unbinding. "I must reach the seventh circle," Prince Imrahil called to Lord Elrond, The binding requires a voice from the world of men to anchor it in mortality. "Go!" replied the elf lord, parrying a blow from Morgamir that would have split a mountain. "I shall hold him here as long as strength remains to me." Prince Imrahil fought his way across the nightmare battlefield, his sword cutting through enemies that dissolved at his touch, only to reform moments later. Behind him, the duel between Elrond and Morgamir continued to shake the very pillars of heaven, while around them, the war between order and chaos raged on. At last, he reached the seventh circle, now cracked and filled with shadow, and took his place upon the ancient stone. The horn of Dol Amroth, damaged but not destroyed, came to his lips once more, and its silver voice rose above the din of battle. But this time, he was not alone in the song of binding. From across the water came new voices, Captain Boromir and his company, arriving at the crucial moment with reinforcements from Minas Tirith. Their war horns joined his in a harmony of mortality and determination that gave new strength to the failing spell. The binding took hold once more, but at a terrible cost. Lord Elrond fell with Orcrist still blazing in his hand, his immortal strength finally spent in holding back the tide of chaos. Around the lake, many of the sea-ward elves faded like morning mist, their essence consumed in the great working that held Morgamir at bay. As the ancient evil sank back into enforced slumber, and the Uvanimo retreated to lick their wounds in the deep places, Prince Imrahil stood in the seventh circle and felt the weight of victory and loss equal measure. The binding would hold for another age, but the price paid for that security had been higher than any could have foreseen. And in the depths of his heart, he knew that this had been only the first battle in a war that would span the ages, with each victory bought in blood and sacrifice. 7 days after the second binding of Morgamir, Prince Imrahil stood once more upon the shore of Tol Brandir, but the scene before him bore little resemblance to the battlefield where heroes had fallen and legends had been born. The ancient isle rose from waters that ran clear and clean beneath the autumn sun, its rocky flanks showing no trace of the corruption that had nearly torn reality asunder. Yet the silence that hung over the lake was deeper than mere peace. It carried within it the echo of voices that would never speak again, of lights that had been extinguished in the service of a greater cause. Where once the seven circles had blazed with power, now only 6 remained intact. The seventh had cracked beyond repair during the final binding, its ancient stones scattered like the fragments of a broken crown. "It is done," said Lord Mithrelus quietly, his pale form seeming more translucent than before, as if the great working had cost him some essential part of his being. "The binding will hold for 3,000 years, perhaps more, but the price." He gestured toward the empty spaces where his companions had stood, warriors of legend who had given their immortal existence to strengthen the spell. "The price grows steeper with each turning of the wheel." Prince Imrahil nodded grimly, his own bearing marked by the weight of leadership and loss. The horn of Dol Amroth hung silent at his side, its silver surface now bearing cracks, spoke eloquently of the strain it had endured. Like its bearer, the ancient artifact had survived the trial, but not unchanged. "Lord Elrond lived," he said, seeking what comfort could be found in small victories. When Captain Boromir's healers found him upon the shore, life still flickered within him, though barely. He sleeps now in the houses of healing, and the wise say he may yet wake, though much of his power has been spent. "A miracle indeed," agreed Mithrelus. "Few who duel with such primordial forces survive the encounter with mind and body intact. Perhaps the Valor watch over him still, for his labors in their service have been long and faithful." From the ruins of the seventh circle came a sound like distant thunder, though the sky above remained clear and cloudless. Both immortal and mortal turned toward the broken stones, watching as a figure emerged from shadows that seemed too deep for the bright morning light. It was Captain Boromir, but changed by his experiences in ways that went beyond the mere physical. His face bore new lines of wisdom and sorrow, and his eyes held depths that spoke of visions granted to few mortals. In his hands he carried fragments of stone from the broken circle, their surfaces still warm with residual power. The "The steward bids me ask what is to be done with these," he said, his voice carrying a gravity that had not been there before the battle. "The wise say they still hold echoes of the binding, and should not be left to lie abandoned upon the shore." Prince Imrahil considered the question carefully, weighing options and implications with the thoroughness that had served him well through decades of leadership. But before he could answer, Lord Mithrelus spoke with sudden urgency, his immortal eyes fixed upon the stone fragment with an expression of dawning recognition. "Those are not merely pieces of the binding circle," he said slowly, his voice carrying a weight of terrible understanding. "Look closer at the runes carved upon their surface. They are not the same symbols that were there before." Indeed, as Prince Imrahil and Captain Boromir examined the fragments more closely, they could see that new characters had been etched into the stone during the final binding, symbols that seemed to writhe and shift when viewed directly, as if they existed only partially in the visible world. "What do they say?" asked Boromir. Though something in his tone suggested he feared the answer, Lord Mithrelus was silent for a long moment, his ancient knowledge wrestling with concepts that challenged even his vast understanding. When he finally spoke, his words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples of implication that would spread far beyond this quiet shore. "They speak of cycles within cycle, of bindings that are also releases, and of purposes served in ways that even the wise did not foresee." He looked up from the stones to meet their gazes, his eyes bright with a mixture of wonder and dismay. The Uvanimo were not seeking to free Morgomir from his prison. They were seeking to strengthen. The revelation struck both mortal men like a physical blow. Everything they had believed about the nature of their enemies, about the purpose of the binding, about the very meaning of their struggle, suddenly shifted sand beneath their feet. "That cannot be," protested Captain Boromir. "We saw them weakening the ancient spells, heard them singing songs of dissolution. They sought to bring chaos and destruction upon Middle-earth." "Did they?" asked Mithrelus quietly. "Or did they seek to ensure that chaos remained safely contained? Consider, if they had truly wished Morgomir to break free, why did they not simply shatter the binding entirely when they first discovered it? They possessed the power, and they certainly had the knowledge. Instead, they weakened it just enough to draw us here, to force us to renew and strengthen the prison with our own sacrifices." Prince Imrahil felt the world spinning around him as the implications became clear. "You're saying that everything, the false ships, the tunneling beneath Ithilien, the corruption of Nen Hithoil, all of it was orchestrated to bring us to this point?" "Not orchestrated," corrected Mithrelus. "Guided. The Uvanimo are fragments of the discord that existed before creation, yes, but they are also children of Eru in their own way, bound by the music, even as they rebel against it. They know that Morgomir's freedom would mean the unmaking of all things, including themselves, so they play their part in the great pattern, ensuring that each generation of guardians is tested and found worthy before the binding is renewed." The silence that followed this explanation was profound, broken only by the gentle lapping of waves against the shore of Tol Brandir. In the distance, the great pillars of the Argonath continued their eternal watch, indifferent to the small dramas that played out in their shadow. "Then we have been pawns in some cosmic game," asked Boromir bitterly. "Our courage, our sacrifice, our fallen comrade, all of it mere pieces moved about for the amusement of powers beyond our understanding?" "No," said Prince Imrahil firmly, his voice carrying the authority of one who had looked into the abyss and chosen to stand firm against it. "We may not have understood the full pattern, but our choices were still our own. When the moment came to stand or flee, to fight or surrender, to sacrifice or preserve ourselves, in those moments we chose. And it is by such choices that the worth of any being is measured, mortal or immortal." Lord Mithrelus smiled, and for the first time since the battle, some of the ancient light returned to his eyes, spoken like a true son of Numenor. "Yes, the pattern may be vast beyond our comprehension, but we are not puppet dancing to its tune. We are partners in the music, each adding our own voice to the great symphony. The Uvanimo may have guided events, but they could not have compelled us to courage. that came from within. As if summoned by their word, a new figure appeared on the shore, the same mysterious messenger who had brought warning to Minas Tirith, though now his form seemed less threatening and more sorrowful. He approached the three companions with the measured pace of one who bears news both bitter and sweet. "The pattern is complete," he said in his voice, like wind through winter trees. "The binding is renewed, stronger than before, because it was wrought with full knowledge of its cost. Morgamir sleeps again, and will sleep until the world itself grows old and the stars begin to fail." "And the Uvánimo?" asked Prince Imrahil. "What becomes of them now that their purpose is served?" "They return to the deep places to wait and watch, as they have done since the world began. They are the eternal guardian, ensuring that some powers remain safely bound, while others are allowed to wake and work their will. Without them, the balance would fail, and either stagnation or chaos would claim all creation." The messenger turned his hidden gaze toward the broken fragments of the seventh circle, and his voice took on a note of something like reverence. "These stones carry within them the echo of every binding that has been wrought upon this isle, from the first days when Gil-galad's power sealed the prison to this moment, when mortal courage renewed the spell. They are sacred beyond the understanding of any single age." "Seat, what should be done with them?" asked Captain Boromir, still struggling with the implications of all he had learned. "They should be divided among the realms of the free people," replied the messenger. "Let Gondor keep one fragment, and Rohan another. Send pieces to Rivendell and to the Shire, to the halls of the dwarves and the forests of the elves. In each place, let them serve as a reminder that some burdens must be shared across all the children of Eru, and that the price of safety is eternal vigilance." As the sun reached its zenith above Nen Hithul, the three companions gathered the stone fragments and prepared to bear them back to the world of men. Behind them, Tol Brandir rose eternal and unchanging from the dark waters, keeping its secrets as it had for age upon age. Lord Mithrellis was the last to board the waiting ships, pausing at the water's edge to look back at the ancient isle one final time. "We will not meet again in this form," he said to Prince Imrahil. "The Sea-Ward elves have played their part in the music, and now we fade into legend as all things must in their time. But remember, the binding holds not by magic alone, but by the courage of those who choose to stand against the darkness. Guard that courage well, for upon it hangs the fate of all that is fair and good in Middle-earth." With those words, he stepped aboard his ship of pearl and starlight, and the strange vessel began to fade even as it moved away from shore. Within moments, it had vanished entirely, leaving only ripples on the water to mark its passing. Prince Imrahil stood in the prow of his own ship as it turned southward toward the lands of men, the fragments of the seventh circle secured safely in a casket of mithril and oak. In his heart, he carried the knowledge that he had been part of something far greater than any single battle or binding, a pattern of sacrifice and renewal that stretched back to the beginning of the world and would continue until its ending. The mist that had given this tale its name had lifted from Tol Brandir, revealing truths both bitter and beautiful. And as Numaramar carried its passengers home through the gathering dusk, the ancient isle settled back into its eternal vigil, patient and watchful beneath the turning stars. In the deep places far below, Morgamir slept the sleep of ages, held fast by chains of song and sacrifice that would endure as long as courage lived in the hearts of the free peoples. And somewhere in the shadows between worlds, the Uvánimo began their long wait for the next turning of the wheel, when new guardians would be called to take up the burden that each generation must bear in its turn. The Fourth Age had begun in earnest, marked not by the departure of the elves alone, but by the understanding that mortal hearts could hold as much courage as immortal one, and that the smallest light could indeed drive back the greatest darkness, if those who bore it were willing to pay the price that such illumination demanded. Upon the waters of Anduin, the ships of Gondor sailed homeward through the deepening night, carrying with them the seeds of legends that would be told in the halls of kings when the White City was but a memory, and the names of its heroes had passed into song. The binding held, the vigil continued, and Middle-earth slept safely beneath the stars, guarded by the eternal courage of those who chose to stand against the night. Thus ends the tale of the mist over Tol Brandir, as it was told in the halls of the kings and recorded in the books of lore, so that future generations might know the price that was paid for their peace and be ready to pay it again when their time came to choose between the light and the dark.